Well, today has brought a clear sign of the uphill battle facing the new Chancellor John Healey ahead of the autumn budget. New official figures show the government borrowed more than expected last month, driven higher by increased spending on benefits. We'll speak about the political context of all this in just a second with Steve Swinford, the Times' political editor. But here in the studio now is Richard Fletcher, business editor for the Times. Richard, just put us in the picture about what drove this higher than expected borrowing in the first place.
Yeah, so typically July is actually one of those rare good months for borrowing. We have even actually seen the occasional surplus in July. It's the month when self-assessment tax receipts are accounted for. But actually, as you say, we saw an unexpected 1.8 billion deficit. There had been expectations of a 500 million surplus or even a balanced budget. So spending was outpaced revenues due to this 2 billion surge in social benefits. Now that includes pensions as well as welfare payments, and there was also a 1.2 billion increase in departmental staff and other costs. So year-to-date borrowing for 26-27 now stands at 56.7 billion. Now, that is lower than last year. We are one of the few G7 countries that is actually reducing our deficit, but it is running more than 2 billion higher than that had been predicted by the Office for Budget Responsibility. So,
Richard, when you look at all the promises that Andy Burnham has made over the last few weeks of being Prime Minister, there's not that much scope, is there, for his Chancellor to raise borrowing in the budget?
No, absolutely. John Healey faces a severely constrained fiscal position. We obviously won't know how constrained until he stands up and we see the OBR report and their calculations. But rising market interest rates, that we've got borrowing costs for governments around the world rising at the moment, not just here in the UK. We think that probably means his headroom's down to an estimated 17 billion. It was probably standing at about 24 billion in March. So that leaves virtually no scope to increase borrowing, given that the Burnham and his new Chancellor have promised to stick to Labour's self-imposed fiscal rules.
I'll go to Steve in just a second, but just before we do, I saw this striking quote from the Tories today saying we spend more on just the interest of our soaring debt than we do on our defence, police and prisons combined. Now, I take your point about the UK reducing some of its borrowing, but these are the real life consequences, aren't they?
Absolutely. The Conservatives obviously correctly point out that national debt costs are outweighing those spending on services and sort of framing it as fiscal mismanagement. I suppose the Labour Party would counter that the government is cutting faster than any G7 peer, and that a lot of that deficit was run up during the various Conservative administrations. So yeah, absolutely.
Richard, don't go away because I want to come back to you for a final thought in just a second. But let's go to Steve Swinford now, who's political editor for The Times. He's on the line. Good afternoon, Steve.
Good afternoon.
I want to come to you with some breaking news in just a second, but let's just to reflect on what you've heard from Richard there. And, pretty sort of gruelling backdrop to the budget ahead, isn't it?
It's not just the budget either. So if we look at the political context, Andy Burnham has had a pretty nice summer, arguably. His popularity is still pretty high. He's done lots of gridded announcements that have gone quite well. And the honeymoon is still very much over. But I can tell you, in just over a week from now, Parliament comes back, and it comes back with a bang. The issues are piling up. The budget is huge and probably will entail tax rises, as we're talking about now, but that's just the beginning of it. You've got the mass release of very serious prisoners coming. That's on the first day of Parliament. They're going to announce how they're going to deal with that. You've got issues like welfare coming. You've got the conferences. All of these issues are piling up, and that's all against the backdrop of continued small boat crossings. So I guess the point I would make is the trade-offs are coming. The difficult decisions are coming, and that Andy Burnham is about to learn, just as the 6 prime ministers that preceded him in the space of 10 years have learned, that governing is really difficult. And the test for Andy Burnham is, can he sustain that popularity when all of these trade-offs come?
Well, let's talk about a couple of those difficult decisions, because we had that quote that I just put to Richard from the Tories about spending more on the interest of our soaring debt than on defence, police and prisons combined. Let's talk about defence, because he's got a defence black hole he's got to fill, hasn't he?
He's got an immediate black hole, several black holes actually, but the first one is he needs to find an extra £4.7 billion in this budget. This was one of kind of Keir Starmer's dying days pledges when he announced a big uplift in defence spending without actually saying how he was going to pay for it. So that's number one on the list. But there's also a much broader issue, which is the government has promised to hit 3% of GDP on defence spending at some point. We don't know when. They've got to set that out. We think they're going to do that next year now to kind of postpone that. But either way, these are big decisions. And if you're obviously spending more on defence, that means you have to cut spending elsewhere ultimately or raise taxes.
Right, well, that brings me on to my next question about one of the difficult decisions he's got to make, which is welfare. And because the higher borrowing figures were driven in part by increased spending on benefits. Now, of course, as Richard points out, that includes pensions. But there is an urgency, isn't there, to tackling that welfare bill?
And look, no one wants to go anywhere near pensions. It's politically toxic. So everyone is signed up seemingly in perpetuity to the triple lock, under which pensions rise by wages, inflation, or one other factor. I can't remember what it is right now, but either way, they go up in perpetuity. So that politically is seen as too toxic. So can anyone do anything about benefits? We've got two big reviews that are going to come after the budget, probably around October. One by a guy called Alan Milburn, a former Labour cabinet minister, another by Stephen Timms, who's an MP, who's done a lot of work on this. But Burnham has said that he wants to reduce the welfare bill, which is fine, but he's also opposed to crude cuts. Well, actually, at some point, difficult decisions are going to have to be made. There's a stat I always come back to on this, which is that for every £25 spent on benefits, £1 is spent on employment support. And that is an insane ratio. Obviously a problem with it. But if you want to spend more on employment support, that means you have to spend less on benefits at some point. And getting that past Labour MPs is really difficult.
Well, I want to ask you both now about this breaking news about the fact that one of Andy Burnham's advisors, Jim O'Neill, won't apparently be joining him in government. The FT reporting that story. Steve, first, who is it? Tell us why he matters and who is he and how big a deal this is.
Well, first of all, I'm going to selfishly take credit for that story. We broke that story.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Steve.
It was at the time splash that he was unlikely to go in.
Oh, right, yes, sorry, yes, you did.
It was interesting, and we splashed it for two reasons, right? The first was he has a blind trust. Going into government would require him to divest all his business interests, effectively put them into a blind trust so he doesn't know what's going on with them. And he didn't want to do that. He's got one of the longest register of interests in the House of Lords. So that was problem number one. Problem number two, which was the far more significant issue, is he is resolutely opposed to wealth taxes. And we revealed that one of the reasons he didn't want to go into government was because there are obviously concerns that Andy Burnham is going to jack up capital gains tax or other wealth taxes. That was something he is opposed to, and therefore it would lead to potential disagreements. So Andy Burnham did everything in his power to try to win over Jim O'Neill. He offered him very senior positions, ministerial positions of government, advisory roles in Number 10, everything basically. These negotiations have been going on for months now, but at the end of the day he couldn't do it. And I'm told there is a degree of significant frustration in Number 10, and indeed someone suggested to me the PM's pretty irritated that he couldn't win round Jim O'Neill. But look, at the end of the day, it looks like it was just too much of a step for him on those two areas that we've discussed there.
And Steve, you are quite right that you did break that story, and I read it on holiday. I'd just forgotten since I got back from holiday because I've had so much on, but it was a very good story. FT following that today in your wake. Richard, your reflections on Jim O'Neill, how big a blow is this to Andy Burnham?
Well, he's obviously a very big figure, both in politics and in the city, former Goldman Sachs. I think one of the interesting problems with the Starmer administration was that the Prime Minister was very detached from sort of the economics and actually only really brought in an economics team towards the end of his administration. He sort of left that to the Chancellor, and I think that was a mistake. And I think it will be good if Burnham does have some, really quality advisors in Number 10 on the economics. So we'll have to wait and see who he opts for instead.
Well, I did want to move on, but I'm just going to ask you both one more question because I do want to put this to you. Richard, first, the yields on UK bonds have been pushed up by a sell-off in sovereign debt led by the US. Just explain what's behind that and how this fits into, Andy Burnham's stance on the bond markets. Remember he said he didn't want to be in hock to the bond markets. Just put all this in context for us.
Yeah, so we've seen a global sell-off this week. There's kind of a growing concern. So there's firstly the concern that Trump's appointment to the Fed, Kevin Walsh, isn't going to raise rates. So he's not going to deal with inflation. The president appointed him because he didn't think he was going to raise rates, and therefore, despite rising inflationary pressures, the market's fear he's not going to raise rates. The second fear, obviously, is inflation. There's no sign of any resolution to the US-Iran war. Oil is now trading above $90 a barrel again, and has been for some time. And as we all know, that leads to inflation. And then thirdly, we've actually seen a lot of the big AI and tech companies raising huge amounts of money through debt, so in the bond markets, and that's competing for funds that would in the past have bought government debt. So that's all spooked the markets. We've seen the US sort of try and intervene in the bond markets, and it appears, we'll have to see what happens in the coming weeks, because it may prove to be successful, but initially that has been unsuccessful, which has sort of added to the jitters. And we've got a big meeting of central bankers next week, the so-called Jackson Hole meeting, which takes place in a very pretty part of Wyoming. So we'll have all of the big bankers there, including Walsh and Bailey and various others. So I suspect we'll hear a lot more about this next week.
Steve, final thought on Andy Burnham's sort of journey, really, to becoming Prime Minister, and now he's in office. He'd said he didn't want to be in hock to the bond markets. Do you think it's coming home to him what a sort of knife edge the UK economy's on?
It is, and look, ultimately, all prime ministers come into office with huge ambitions to change the country and do things, and then they meet the markets, and they meet Britain's very straitened fiscal circumstances. They all say they're going to get growth going, and then ultimately they really struggle to do so. So that's the test for Andy Burnham. It's a really simple test. Can he grow the economy? And if he doesn't do that, I think voters, he will experience problems when it comes to the election next year. And if he does do that, then he could be very successful. But it is really, really hard to do.
Well, crystal clear analysis from both of you. Thank you both very much. Richard Fletcher and Steve Swinford there. And of course, you can read both of their stories in the Times tomorrow and every day, most days, in fact. Very prolific journalists there.